I'm delighted you're here. I'm Geneva Overholser. I'm the director of the Annenberg School of Journalism. I recognize a lot of your faces. We appreciate your being here. These directors' forums, for those of you who were here last year, already know. For those of you who are here new this year, we have used these, which occur every Tuesday at noon, as a way to bring preponderantly a series of people who are really thinking about emerging ways of telling stories and about new forms of journalism. Although we've used them for a variety of other purposes. We've had at least one of our journalism faculty who had a new book last year, Phil C. We're going to do that again this year with two of our faculty members who have new books, Casey Cole and Tim Page. We also have used them to explore students' work, which is cool. So we've had News 21, which is our wonderful summer program. We've got one of those scheduled again this fall. And we have a terrific group of people coming already scheduled. We hope they actually come. Today is Lisa Shepard, if she makes it. I hope so. I could give you a little bit of information about her. It might kind of bring her spirit here more quickly. I've known Lisa a long time. She's a good friend and a remarkable and capable journalist. She wrote for American Journalism Review, did very interesting pieces on changes in the journalism world, and most recently has been for several years now the Ombudsman for National Public Radio. And she was here speaking with Michelle Lavander, our colleague who has a wonderful California Endowment Health Fellowship. She was here speaking with their group earlier this week. And so now she's in town, not coming from D.C. and therefore much delayed. She is also quite active in the Journalism and Women's Symposium, which is an interesting group of people, and some of our faculty members have engaged in that as well. I think here she is. I just introduced you. Welcome. We are delighted you're here, Lisa.
You just introduced me. No?
Yes, I did. I thought I would.
I knew I'd heard that.
I thought I'd jammed for a while. How are you? It's good to see you. So this is Lisa. I told folks that you're ombudsman at NPR and a good friend, and also active in the Journalism and Women's Symposium, which is a really interesting organization. And one of the things I most admire about Lisa is that, unlike some of us, when she sees a panel, for example, or a group of articles that reflect 50% of the population, but not the other 50%, you know, a panel which seems to intimate that there isn't a whole lot of wisdom on the part of women to be offered up. Lisa calls it like she sees it, which I very much commend and think is a terribly important thing. So we are delighted you're here. I think I'm supposed to switch my mic to you because we're being recorded.
Yeah.
So I'll do that. And I will get you some water.
Okay.
And I'll save you lunch. So,
all right. Let's see. I hope this is working. It's interesting that Geneva would mention that. As the ombudsman for NPR, I have different jobs within that job. I mean, it's pretty much how I want to create it, but a lot of it comes from listener complaints. People send emails in and you know, they don't like this, they don't like that. Some of it's worth investigating, and some of it is just things that I think are important, that I, as a listener to NPR, I think should be investigated. And so I had an intern this summer who was really great, and I said, let's just see how many female voices are on NPR. So I'm not a feminazi, you know, I just feel that...
We'll ask Rush about that.
There's a default position, let's go to the men. And I know there are men in here, and I love you all. But I think that the message that gets sent over and over is that, you know, women aren't smart, women aren't authoritative, women aren't experts. When they're not on these panels, when they're not on the op-ed pages, when they're not on television, on Meet the Press, that's one of my bugaboos all the time is because I get the rundown every Saturday, and it's usually mostly white men. Anyway, that is, so how to do something like that, I just think it's an interesting research question, because obviously that's very labor intensive. So what we tried to do, and it's still in the midst of it, was like start on a Monday we wanted to get 2 months worth, but we weren't going to do every day and look at Morning Edition and look at All Things Considered, which are the two main shows that NPR has sole responsibility for the editorial content. So like Monday back in April, then Tuesday the next week, and then Wednesday the following week, and so that we can't be accused of being selective about the, oh, well, you picked those 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks happen to be, you know, just bad examples. So we'll see. But, you know, it's looking like what I thought it would look. And even last week, the media correspondent, who I like very much, Shaven Folkenflik, did 2 pieces that were on Morning Edition and only talked to white men. Now, you know, he was covering something that was a conference, but still, I just think you have to really work hard to get diverse voices on the air. First of all, it's a turnoff. I get turned off when I see panels that are all female. No, I'm sorry, that are all male. And that's what I do. I send emails and say, you know, I wouldn't attend this panel, and I write about ethics. I teach media ethics at Georgetown University at the grad school level, and I consider it unethical to have a panel that is all the same gender. So, you know, it could be used both ways. Anyway, I think I was going to talk about online ethics, media ethics. And it's just, it's obviously, you know, the internet is revolutionizing, that we are in the midst of a media revolution. And it's not often that you can say that you actually know it and you can feel it. But since it has such a prescribed beginning of 1993, when the first newspaper went on the web, which is not that long ago, and that was the San Jose Mercury. And I was, at that time, I worked at the San Jose Mercury, and I did not understand. Someone named Bill Mitchell, who works for the Poynter Institute, he was out there. I could not even begin to grasp what he was doing off in this little room. I mean, you all have grown up with it, but even, I thought I'd present you with some statistics that I think are really interesting. They were, however, compiled by UCLA. For their, what was it, the UCLA Center for Communications Policy. So they looked at how long it took to equip 30% of homes with modern technology, just 30%. So it took 46 years to equip 30% of the homes with electricity. It took 38 years for telephones. It took 17 years for TV, and it took 7 years where 30% of American households had the internet. And so at the beginning of 1994, there were 20 newspapers that had websites. By 2000, well, and I'll say by mid-1995, there were 300 newspapers that had websites. So only 300 in 1995, that's only 14 years ago. By 2000, there were 4,500 newspapers and 1,400 TV. So as you know, probably from your classes, the news business has lagged in terms of getting the internet and realizing what could be done with it, and it's not to their credit, and it has a lot to do with where they are today. But it's also an interesting line of demarcation of 1998, because that's when broadband became widely accessible. So that's only 11 years ago. And prior to that, 1996, how old were many of you? How many of you were using the internet in 1996? And so you will remember you would type in an URL, and then you'd go get a sandwich, and you come back, and you have time to go get a magazine. So it's really fascinating to think that you are experiencing and able to witness this media revolution. And it's, you know, so the internet is awesome in terms of, you know, having unlimited capacity, interactivity, on-demand availability. But, you know, at this time when the internet has sort of turned the news business upside down, and, you know, long-held traditions are being questioned, I think it's really important to maintain high ethical standards for the news business because, I say this over and over, credibility is the only asset that you have as a journalist, whether it's for TV, radio, internet, who knows, for telephones, if that's the medium that you're going to be broadcasting on. But it really is true. It doesn't matter how good a writer you are. It doesn't matter how great a reporter you are. If you don't have credibility, you don't have really anything. So that's why I think high ethical standards are extremely important. Now, let me ask a quick question. I'd like to be able to open this up, so should I maybe talk for 15 minutes
exactly.
and then...
10 more or something? And then
All right. So, no matter what the tools or the technologies that we embrace, what still matters most are these core principles of fairness, accuracy, and thoroughness. And Dan Gilmore, who's an expert on online media, said, these are not afterthoughts, fairness, accuracy, thoroughness. They are essential if the journalism profession is going to survive. So in addition to this revolution, then you have this recession that has got everybody very nervous about how do you grow ad revenues and circulation down, subscriptions down, so you have these two things coming at a time that, you can look at it as thrilling, but it also makes people a little bit uncomfortable in terms of how you're going to get these ad revenues, and there are some questionable practices that can come as a result of efforts to increase ad revenues. Maybe some of you are familiar with what they're calling Salon-gate that happened at the Washington Post, where they were attempting to find new ways of getting revenue by having salons at the publisher's house, and you could pay $25,000 to go, and if the topic was healthcare, in this case, Kaiser was going to sponsor it, and so you're basically buying access, access to Washington Post reporters, access to whoever's on the panels that they had, as well as these things being off the record. So just really a bad idea, but an attempt for the Washington Post to find new sources of revenue. So this is, again, why somebody has to be always asking, is this a good thing for our business in terms of ethics and protecting our brand? As somebody who sort of grew up as a mainstream journalist, it wasn't until 1996 that I realized that the newspapers and outlets like NPR are brands. I always thought brands were Kellogg's and Skippy peanut butter, but the idea of protecting the brand is because you go to the New York Times or you go to the LA Times or you go to NPR's website and you know that there is a certain level of high standards and that you're going to get credible news and good, solid information. And so you always have to be protecting the brand. There's some other things that I think that will probably concern you, that online journalists are twice as likely as print and broadcast journalists to say that owners and advertisers try to influence news coverage. And this was according to a March 2008 Pew Research study. That survey said that 1/4% of print and broadcast journalists saw this kind of influence, while half of the online journalists did. And I mean, so these are things to really be concerned about. You have this desire to do good journalism. You have this pressure to get ad revenues or some sort of revenues to be able to do the kind of good journalism that you want. And so again, one of the ways to maintain or make sure that journalism maintains its core principles is by keeping high ethical standards. How many of you have read a journalism ethics code? Okay, well, the one that I think is probably the best, the simplest, is the Society for Professional Journalists. It's on spj.com. Is there a SPJ chapter here at USC?
No.
well, maybe one of you will be motivated to start it. But
actually, Andrew Lee, one of our new faculty members, is interested in starting one, so it may be the year. You're right.
yeah, and you know, you just offer pizza and Coke, and they will come. But in just simply, the SPJ ethics code says seek truth and report it, minimize harm, act independently, and be accountable. And I think that last one of be accountable is very important today, especially you know, when that you do maybe have questionable sources or you're getting funding from someone that someone else might be concerned about. So I think that that's why disclosure is very important. As an example, right now NPR is taking corporate funding from something called Ally Bank. And they are quite heavily supporting NPR. Well, Ally Bank changed its name on May 15th, and it used to be called GMAC, General Motors Acceptance Corporation. And it took $21 billion of TARP money. And now they've, you know, it's fair. I mean, they're trying to present themselves as an online bank. And so I'm thinking now that maybe NPR needs to say Ally Bank used to be General Motors Acceptance Corporation, that's important to disclose that kind of information. And this is just talking about money that they're getting from funders. So anyway, if you do keep, I mean, I do think ethics codes can be very helpful to you in doing any kind of journalism. And when you say seek truth and report it, that's great, that's obvious, but I think the minimize harm is something that we don't think a lot about. One of the things that I have my class do is to bring in an ethics code. Just go on the web, find one from some news organization. And what we've noticed is that a lot of them are very concerned about protecting the newspaper. And that is the focus when you read it. It's all about protecting the newspaper. But you know, minimizing harm is thinking more about the audience and the people, your subjects and your sources. The ethical challenges right now in this new medium abound. And I'm going to talk about a few of them. But one of them is just you know, keeping your facts straight in a medium built on speed. So there's really a danger now that the verification process will be neglected as there's a rush to be first. And you know, Michael Jackson was a great example of that, of you know, how quickly, how clearly did you have that information and what you should do with it. And there is an attitude among people who are not mainstream traditional journalists, which is, you know, publish it and then correct it. And that can be very dangerous because with search engine crawls, you know, they just go around and look for stuff. So you may have corrected online, but it very well be possible that the original version, it gets picked up and repeated. I mean, there's a famous anecdote of I think it was United Airlines, and a search engine picked up an old story about United Airlines. It was either involved in a crash or there were problems with the plane. And that story got, you know, picked up on Google, and the stock price just plummeted. And so, I mean, that's an extreme example, but so the idea of publish first, correct later, I think is a bad idea. And so I think, again, it's important that you make sure that you have your facts straight for whatever you put online. And the interesting thing about online that is really great is that it can be searched. And so, you know, NPR, I think, used to feel like it was very difficult for people to pick up their stories because there was, you know, it's on the air and then it's gone. And that's the same is true with television. NPR just relaunched or redesigned its website, and now they have transcripts for every story. And that makes it easier to find the stories because you can actually do a search for the stories. So, The other thing that concerns me in terms of keeping the facts straight is that online journalism requires that reporters pretty much be their own editors as well, as so that they can function without the layer of backstop editing that happens in traditional mediums. So, as an example, at NPR, and this concerns me, they started a blog. It's called The Two-Way, which that name is up for quite a few jokes. The three-way is I don't know. But anyway, they're two veteran bloggers. One was hired from USA Today. One was hired from the Chicago Tribune, and they are supposed to fill in the news between morning edition, which usually is over by 10, and All Things Considered, which starts at 4. And they just blog the news, and nobody reads what they put up there. No, I don't mean to say nobody edits what they put up there. I'm sure that. Oh, scratch that, delete that.
Not an ethical problem.
Yeah, so it doesn't matter. But anyway, I feel that when I write something for the Ombudsman blog, I have somebody who I have hired who doesn't work for NPR but used to work at NPR, so he's familiar with the way it operates. But I just couldn't imagine putting something up there without having someone else take a look at it, because everybody needs an editor. That was Ben Bradley's famous line, the former editor of the Washington Post. Kinsey Wilson, who now heads NPR's digital operation, used to do that for USA Today, and he said, as an example, USA Today print version had as many as 6 photo editors looking at a picture before it went in the newspaper. And for online, the selection is made more quickly with less expertise and less editing involved. And this, gives rise to the criticism that online journalism doesn't value quality the way that is valued for the traditional mediums. And I think that to me is a problem, and it's this kind of thinking of we got to be first, we got to get it up there, that speed is a value and it just needs to be up there fast, and I think that could pose problems. So the idea that there's some news organizations, I think it was Dave Zeke he's of the News Tribune in Tacoma. He said you should think of blogging like live television, and you correct as you go along. You don't have 8 hours to do 3 levels of editing again, but I think that could be, can create a problem. And as an example, at NPR, in terms of different standards, the digital side can put something up right away about the Middle East. And the Middle East has been just a thorn in NPR's side. Back in 2002, when things really heated up over there, there's a group called Camera. I don't know if any of you are familiar with them, but what is it? Committee, Arab, whatever. The name is almost astroturfed in terms of what they really do. But they were very successful, and they cost one of the public radio stations $1 million in Boston. So NPR felt that they needed to respond, and so they did several things. One, they aggregate all stories about the Middle East, and at that time they would give transcripts away for free. They basically were saying, read everything. Don't judge us based on one story. But they also decided that anything that was on newscasts, which is the hourly reports, could not. They have a separate unit, and they just they do the news. They're not connected to All Things Considered, but they decided that anything newscasted had to be checked out by the foreign editor or his assistant who deals with Middle East news. So they were so concerned about being careful. And they still have that kind of uneven, it's okay to put up an AP story. So I ran into something that I wrote about back in January, where the AP published something, and then the blogger for NPR basically took that story, and this was at the time of the most recent war, and it basically said something like Hamas had broken the ceasefire treaty. And as such as it was, well, I asked the foreign editor for the radio side, would you have published that story? And he said, no, I would not have, because it's too unclear who actually broke the treaty. So I think I'm basically trying to give you a lay of the land. So within this one news organization, you have almost like competing values, and I think that they should be more consistent. I think blogging, actually what I'll really just, blogging in terms of blogging the news is somewhat problematic, because to make a blog really interesting, you have to be provocative, and that in that sense you may be voicing your opinion. But what I guess with the limited time I have, I'm going to talk about two things, and one is Facebook and Twitter. And so Facebook is awesome in terms of as a news tool. How many of you, let's see, who's not on Facebook in here? Okay, well, that's, so there's two things. Facebook is a great way to promote your stories. If you do something, anytime I post something on the Ombudsman blog, which by the way is npr.org/ombudsman. And if you're interested, you can put your email in the right-hand bucket, and anything I write will come to you, and then you can comment on it. That's one way, and I use Twitter in the same thing. So it's as a promotional tool. And Facebook can also be great as a news source. If something happens, someone will form a Facebook group right away, so that's a good source. But you always have to be very careful. You have to make sure that the information is good, in just the same way that you would in print reporting. As you know, the whole idea of interactivity is great, and being able to go out and find new and different sources using Twitter or using Facebook is terrific. But you still have to apply the same standards, and you need to check out that the person is where they say they are. Are they really in Iran, or are they sitting in New York City watching CNN and pretending that they are? And you need to check out that they are who they say they are. Here's just a good quick story that I wrote about, that I thought is kind of emblematic of where we are today. And this was, NPR did a shout out saying, this was back before the inauguration, tell us your stories. You're coming to Washington, D.C. Do you have any poignant stories? And so people sent in emails, and that's one way of collecting information. You just put a call out. You didn't used to. For some reason, NPR has only recently done this. It's not a new technology to, say, send us an email. And people could go online. It was only a year ago that NPR started a social media community, which, just FYI, they did because they realized in personal ads, they saw that people identified themselves like NPR man looking for a woman who plays tennis, listens to NPR, and so that people think of themselves, probably older than you, as identify themselves as NPR. Anyway, so they got in a bunch of different people telling stories about, what the inauguration meant, and they picked 6, and then they ran them. And one of them, I was driving in on Sunday night before the inauguration, and I heard it, and I thought, oh. And if I had time, I would play it for you, or I was happy to send you the link. But the gist was, it was this guy named Chuck, and he was, his name was Chuck Latimer. And he was talking about, he lived in Kentucky, and he really wanted to come to D.C., and he always stays with his sister when he comes, but she was a Republican, she couldn't stand Obama, so he had nowhere to stay, and he couldn't come to D.C. And, he felt that his rights were being infringed, so I usually play that, and then I'll say, what do you think of Chuck's sister, who won't let him stay with her because she doesn't like Obama, and everyone goes, she's a jerk, she's mean-spirited, blah, 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 blah. But, when I listened to that, I thought, what does Chuck's sister have to say? Because, how many of you have brothers and sisters? And I could just imagine, my brother doing something like that, or, and so I saw that from the point of view that basically it could be that Chuck, every time he comes to his sister's house, he drinks all her booze, he trashes it, he's mean to her kids, who knows? So I said, so I talked to this producer and I said, did you call Chuck's sister? And he was like, no. And so I said, well, do you mind if I call Chuck? And so he gave me the number and I called Chuck. And what's interesting was that the first thing I said, so did you come to DC for the inauguration? And he said, well, I forgot my camera and my cell phone wasn't working. Or something. And that was his first response. So what I knew he was trying to tell me is I have no way of documenting it because I didn't take a picture and my cell phone wasn't working. And I said, well, so what did you do? And he said, I stayed with my sister. And I said, oh, did she end up going to the inauguration? And he said, no, she had to work that day. Well, nobody worked that day who wasn't in the news business or essential. It just wasn't possible. And I said, well, what does she do? And he said, well, she's in traffic. And I said, what, stuck? But and I said, what do you mean? He goes, that's all I want to say. And I said, did your sister, what did your sister think of that story? And I asked, could I have her phone number? Absolutely not. She would kill me if she knew that I said that. And so anyway, to follow up, I basically said, well, what do you do? And he said, I work. And I said, what kind of work? Hourly work. These are all kind of clues. And, finally I said, what? And, well, I deliver pizza, which is fine. I mean, that isn't really neither here nor there. But do I think that Chuck really had that story? No, I don't. And NPR should have realized right away when he, if they'd asked can we call your sister? And he said, absolutely no. That should have been the end of the story. So it's a good story, but it also just reminds you that you get these stories, and sometimes stories are too good to check out. I hate it when the facts get in the way of a good story. But it is important to, no matter how you get this information, to still apply the same standards to verify it. So the only other thing that I wanted to talk about is,
remember we have to end at 1.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so it's just. And this is just this concept of commenting and whether or not there is real interactivity when people comment on blogs. And it's something that just to think about. I personally have experienced it in a very negative way, and I see that it's this false sense of democracy and community because we're still stuck in diatribe versus dialogue, and how there doesn't seem to be a lot of dialogue on these websites. And the only way it really works is if you have community standards and community policing. And the New York Times does do that. They pay like 13 people around the country to moderate. They don't put up comments that don't relate to the discussion, or if they're mean-spirited, or if they're attacking someone. So I think that is a kind of whole new world that we need to be thinking about, is the commenting. There's something called the 90/9/1 principle, and if you .org, and it's online just like that. And it's that 90% of the people who read stuff online read it and move on. 9% occasionally comment, and I would put myself in there. And 1% are the online dominators, and they're usually very vocal, and they're very willing to do ad hominem attacks, and I don't. And yet they feel that they're very powerful. So I will open it up.
Could I ask you one question?
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Marilyn. Your story about Chuck made me wonder if you are saying that any comment, no matter how slight, would require a kind of a confirming phone call from.
Well, I'm just thinking in that case, Chuck offered his story up, and it was a good story. But if you think about minimizing harm, I mean, if you listen to this story, it's very hard not to think that his sister is a total jerk.
Is Chuck's whole name on the radio?
Yeah, Chuck Latimer. And I went on Facebook, I tried to find his sister. I got awful one. It was like, No, I'm not related to Chuck. My husband just died, and his name was Chuck. I was like,
I just wanted to ask, why is there a difference in standards between the blogging NPR and the newscast? Like, are there different legal restrictions or?
well, it's valuing speed and just feeling like it's just too time consuming to have somebody else, take another look at the story, and that there isn't enough money or resources to have a separate editing staff for the online.
But are they don't fear being sued for the blogging?
That's why I think the attitude is that you have the people who are blogging for news, when there is no backstop editing, have to be really good and really thorough and make sure. I mean, sure, they're making themselves vulnerable.
At my middle school newspaper, our advisor used to tell us, "I want the facts. I don't care what you think. I want,
Right.
I want the facts." And just looking at the popularity of blogging and Twitter and everything like that, I'm just wondering if you feel like the paradigm has shifted from the audience wanting to hear a voice rather than wanting just the cold facts, and if our writing should try to represent that shift.
I think it depends on what the medium or the organization is. I mean, I think that if I want the facts, then I'm going to go to CNN or the New York Times. If I want to read, someone's opinion, then I think I would seek out either columnists or blogs that have that. So that, again, I have to always say, am I just being too old school, and I think these the tools that the internet offers are fantastic, but I still feel that I want to know that this is credible information. So I don't know, am I alone in that? Is that, I mean, I think that there is a cesspool of information out there. And so, knowing what's good, what's credible, and what isn't, I think is really important. And one of the classes now that they're teaching in high school and in colleges is media literacy, so that you are aware, even if you're reading these blogs, that maybe they're not right, and maybe they're just opinions.
Back to Chuck. I was just curious. This is a great story. Does he, when you found this out, did you make an announcement on air? And regardless of that, what is the policy of NPR to make corrections?
Well, corrections are certainly a way of being more transparent and accountable. And in that case, as the Ombudsman, I wrote a piece about it, and just sort of reminding the staff as well that you still, no matter how you get this information, you still need to check it out. I think that there's there's a word for the whiz-bang, gee-whiz, or something called whizzy, or this sort of, we get really like, wow, this technology is so cool, and we don't sort of think about the implications of the technology or what you're doing. And so, but does NPR do corrections? They do, and they have a page. That was one of the first things that I really pushed for when I got there, because it's ridiculous to think that news organizations don't make mistakes. And so it's so much better to say, we made a mistake, we'll learn from it, we'll try not to do it again, instead of, no, we're... And even right now, they're kind of resistant. They're willing to make corrections if somebody's 27 when we said there was 26. But, in terms of the more subtle, where a correction might be needed.
I know NPR was among the news organizations that got burned on the Pentagon consultant issue.
Yes.
And how did that change your vetting process? And
well, they immediately said really within that first week, Ellen Weiss, who's the head of the news department, wrote a memo and said NPR definitely needs to do a much better job of vetting, and that you can't just assume that because somebody is a retired military general that they are a good source. You need to check them
but
out.
in all story, because David Falkenblick interviewed me soon after that and wanted much more information about myself, and I was really wanting to give. He says, "Oh, sorry, this is all back. Now we have to really vet everybody mean, they were good questions, and they were valid questions, but.
Are you a
about-
professor here?
Yes.
And he wanted more than that? I guess he wanted to.
He wanted my political biases,
Oh,
and, which was fair in this case.
oh, okay.
But it was still, actually, when I heard it on the radio, I thought, gee, wish I kind of hadn't given that interview. There's more out there than I think I wanted to know.
You
But
wanted
he
to
said,
characterize your political
Yeah.
stance
Yes.
in order to comment on the story?
yeah, and he said it's because of this military consultant thing that they had to vet. And I've done commentaries for Morning Edition, and I find that vetting process incredible. I mean, I did a thing about Pluto being demoted to a brown dwarf, and I used it as a metaphor. I mean, it was just a total metaphor. It was a funny piece, and they ran it through their science desk, and by the time we were done, it wasn't funny anymore. So I just, do a lot of vetting as far as I see.
Well, let's, the other thing that I did want to say that I had to get to is just that, we live in the world now where you have to think the mic is always on.
Yeah.
Whether or not there is a little figurative mic or a little mic, that is where, so what you post on Facebook can and will be used against you. Don't put your political leanings up there. What I have is skeptical. And if you're covering something, if you're covering a political race, then you friend both or all 3 or 5 candidates. It's the same thing for the city council. You have to at least put forth the effort to try to appear neutral. The minute that someone can go on your Facebook and see that you are a huge McCain fan and you've got, all these posters and Facebook groups that you're part of, it diminishes your credibility. And it's just something that, whether you like it or not, you need to think about. And the other thing is, nothing can be scrubbed from the internet. Once it's up there, it is up there. And it can't, even if you take down a story, someone else can go into the cache and find it. So I think it's just really important to operate responsibly and realize that when you send emails, they stick around. Be careful when you forward emails because, especially when it's going back and forth and there's a lot of stuff down there. I mean, you just have to be thinking all the time how this stuff can be used against you. There's one other show that NPR does called Tell Me More, and it tries to reach an African American or a multicultural audience. But when the when the Iowa State Supreme Court decided that same-sex marriage was okay, they wanted to do something, and they wanted to have someone from the reporter covering it from the Des Moines Register, and they did an internet search on him, just putting together his bio, and on Facebook he had that he was gay and how happy he was about this decision. And so they said, well, what do you think? Should we have him on? And I said, well, no, probably not, because he's sort of given away his objectivity on this and whether or not. Now, I mean, I know that there's a whole school of thought, and Don Hewitt, the guy who started 60 Minutes, has always argued you should be upfront about your political biases and just be open. And I guess I'm just not there yet because I feel that the public has such a hard time believing journalists anyway.
You mentioned CNN as a source of vetted news, and CNN for a number of years now has had a separate website called iReport, in which it invites anyone to put up a comment, and it's unfiltered, unedited, but anything that they use on CNN, it then goes through the normal vetting process. But still, you've got this iReport outside out there.
But
do you think that's a reasonable model and one that perhaps NPR would want to take up sometime?
Well, at least you know that iReport is coming from citizen journalists and that, it's clear that it isn't vetted by CNN. And I'm not that, I know about it, but I think, and I know Jon Stewart has made lots of fun of iReport. Again, if I'm watching Wolf Blitzer, I think, well, he's applying certain standards that are going to make him more credible to me than something from iReport, which doesn't mean that it isn't, but I might be more skeptical about it.
I understand your the importance of trying to be neutral, to be outside, but at the same time, I think that's an illusion because,
Of course.
for example, when you're choosing words when you're reporting torture, are you going to say enhanced interrogation techniques or
Have you
torture?
been reading my columns?
Actually, yeah, that's why. So, I mean, at the same time, it just seems like an illusion, and you have to come out somewhere on that. I mean, because by saying enhanced interrogation techniques, you're validating
The Bush administration.
right, and
Well, I did come out on saying that as much as possible, describe the techniques. Don't use something like enhanced interrogation techniques, which sounds so bogus, or the word torture. Just try to describe these tactics. I mean, today I heard Nina Totenberg say waterboarding, which tries to simulate drowning. So right away, you get an idea of what waterboarding is, and we're right at a shift right now that just as the news broke yesterday, and you can say, I think they'll be using the word torture more, because now there's a sort of acknowledgement of it. But the word torture really fits into a political debate, not into a personal debate about the meaning of the word.
I was just wondering if you could address the sort of the difference in your mind as ombudsman between an actual conflict and the appearance of conflict. Years ago, I did a public radio series on the relationship between public radio programs, networks, and funders. And
Did you do that for Marketplace?
yeah, for Marketplace.
Yeah, I went back and listened.
Oh, really? It was like about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
We looked at GE, which at the time was underwriting Marketplace, and for example, Archer Daniels Midland,
Right.
which was underwriting a lot of NPR. And what I found, and I've been a contributor to NPR for years, and I talked to people there, and what I found, what I wasn't surprised by, which is there's a really strong firewall in terms of actual conflict. But then at the same time, they would go out and report on ADM's problems when they were getting fined, what was it, huge, like multi-million-dollar fine. And then at the end of that half hour, this program is brought to you by ADM. And so you didn't have an actual journalistic conflict, at least in a literal sense, right? But in my view, you did have an appearance of conflict, and I wonder if you get into that at all.
Well, I think that the appearance is almost the same as the actual conflict. I mean, most of the time there isn't a conflict, but just the appearance of one. And something like that, you wonder, well, how were they approaching covering Archer Daniels Midland? Were they trying to be more aggressive and prove that there was no, influence? And in that sense, that's not fair to Archer Daniels Midland. So the problem of sponsorship, and public radio is definitely a big problem, because right now, NPR isn't doing well financially. It desperately needs more corporate sponsorships, and so there are lines in terms of what can go on the air. So on public radio, you couldn't say, Dave's car dealership, sales this weekend, best in the business, come on down, Chevy's 50,000 or something like that. That would be a call to action. But, right now one of the corporate sponsors is Siemens, which is a corporation that just paid $1 billion fine to the U.S. to the Justice Department for bribing officials to get business. That area of who should be a sponsor for NPR is definitely kind of wishy-washy, because people just feel like, well, NPR should only have the James L. Knight Foundation, or the Wallace or the Ford Foundation, but they need corporate sponsorships to be able to do the kind of journalism that they do.
But I'm troubled by the notion that there is no difference between the appearance of conflict and the actuality of conflict. I mean, I understand your point to be something that most of us, I think, would agree with, which is if there's a strong appearance, then the effect is the same. But I still would argue, especially when we acknowledge that transparency is so important, that there is a real difference, and that the thoughtful observer can ascertain the difference if the news organization is transparent. But I would argue that if you really believe they're the same, that it's really hopeless, because
Yeah.
I found as ombudsman at the Washington Post that there are plenty of things that are in the eye of the observer. And if we just say, well, the only thing that matters is impressions, then nothing matters, because there are some people who are going to think every news coverage is, you know, anti-Catholic or anti-women or whatever, no matter what you do.
Yeah, I guess I would qualify what is the conflict. I mean, certainly, I just do sometimes think that the appearance is as, or has as negative effect as the real conflict. But again, I would think it would have to be more case by case. I mean, not the appearance of it's being anti-Catholic, but I mean, it's always the case of whether or not you think that the advertiser is somehow influencing the coverage. Or, you know, one of the ways that I got started covering the media was when big name broadcast journalists started taking, you know, $30,000 to give speeches to trade groups and, you know, Toyota, and then in that case, you know, it just kind of looked bad. It might not have been bad. There might not have been a real conflict. I used to think, or I thought at the time that, okay, you aren't covering the wheat growers right now, but you might be, and then you have taken $30,000 from just speaking to them. So
I was always fascinated by, you know, when Krugman used that term, the tyranny of objectivity. I don't know if you remember reading that column. I always thought that was a really interesting question to be kind of put out there. And I wonder if you could sort of address that whole issue of, you know, how do you deal with this concept of, on one hand, of being objective and clear and transparent? On the other hand, is there a truth of torture versus enhanced interrogation techniques, or, you know, or some other issues, which brought that one up? And I just wondered if you could talk about how you advise or think about that.
well, I think that is very complicated. And the tyranny of objectivity, what does that mean exactly? I mean, how did he describe that?
Well, that the tyranny of
pretending?
it is called the tyranny of objectivity. He was talking about how, you know, oh, this side says this, that side says that, and that gives you an objective thing without ever really kind of doing any kind of critical thinking about what the situation is.
Right.
And I think it's kind of important as a journalist to be thinking about those when you're crafting stuff. And I'm curious to know.
Well, as Geneva just said, that false equivalency that, you know, well, like, say with climate change, you know, trying to put a side that says, you know, there is no problem with global warming. But I think that, you know, I guess I'm not ready to sort of influence how people think in terms of, I mean, I think you raise a really good point, and it's not that I'm trying to avoid it, it's just that, you know, I've gotten now to a point where I am trying to make a point, and so I can't imagine, you know, that the sort of false equivalency of on the one hand this and on the other hand that, you know, how it seems like that's good journalism, but by just, it seems to me also by what facts you pick and choose to put into a story and who you choose to quote, you are in some way trying to give a full picture. I don't feel that any story comes out right down the middle that I've read recently. I know I'm not answering a question because I'm not sure that there is an answer. Do you have any thoughts?
I think I agree with what's implicit in Nani's question and your answer, which is it's all very much in a state of flux, but it's a terribly interesting conversation, the whole. I mean, how many of you all, a number of you are in our graduate master's program, how many of you would say that objectivity strikes you as not only extremely important, but really a clear guide to ethics in your reporting? Do you have some confidence in it? It'd be interesting for us to hear your thoughts about that, because it's so much in transit, although it has been such a clear touchstone.
I have absolutely no confidence in it. Growing up, as I have, reading all kinds of news sources, I have lost faith in objectivity. Although we were talking about this the other day, and we talked about transparency being sort of, not exactly a replacement for objectivity, but perhaps a better guide than this concept of objectivity, which may have lost its meaning for not just a lot of journalists, but for the audience as well, or the audience as well.
I don't know, I think of objectivity,
if that's what you're going for, I think of it as sort of like this perfect ideal that you can certainly approach. You can certainly get close to it. And I don't think it needs to be black and white, like either this is subjective or it isn't.
I think you could have fairness in the aggregate. So like within the Annenberg faculty, Mark Cooper was a translator for Southwood, and he's not exactly a Republican. There are other people on faculty who I think more lean, but within the collection of voices, then you sense that there's representation.
I think the only way to have true objectivity is to not really care about the subject you're covering.
Yeah, have no dog in that fight.
Exactly, because I mean, not necessarily not to care, but I guess rephrase a little bit, but to have no concern about the outcome of it. As in, you don't care which way it goes. But I speak as a sports person, so that's the way it may, because I don't do politics. But as a sports person,
do you really not care about how it goes in a given game, though?
if I'm covering a game and I have no personal opinion about either of the teams, I'm just hoping for a good game, really. Because that's easier to write about, it's more entertaining for everyone, and compared to if you have a game or an election that's a blowout, it's not going to be something that's going to be more interesting for people to read about.
Would you not cover a game in which you were an ardent fan of one side and despise the other?
No, because I can, put my own personal opinions to the side to write about it. But while I'm at the game, I might have to leave the press box so I can go cheer for myself.
Why couldn't someone do that in politics then?
I didn't say they couldn't.
All right.
I'm just saying that I think the easiest way to have objectivity is to not care about the outcome.
Right, but we acknowledge that sometimes you do care and you have to cover things, and so you can put that aside. But yeah, I wonder it actually.
Except you don't think the gay Iowa. I mean, but then.
Yeah.
It's a very complex.
Yeah, I'm actually curious about the gay Iowa.
That's the thing about all of this talking about ethics is that there's like maybe the best answer, but there are not any clear. To me, the only thing that's clear is you don't take money from a source to do a story. I mean, that seems basic.
I'm stuck on the gay Iowa too, because I so believe in transparency. I so believe in transparency.
Right.
And the idea that the gay Iowa shouldn't have put his sexual identity online is the thing that keeps him from being a worthy source. If he were in the closet, then he would have still been a worthy source. I mean,
but it was more the talking about how great it was that this had happened, and this.
Wouldn't you expect most gay people to have that?
So I
opinion?
know.
Really?
I mean, I think that would be really
gay people were like, oh man, I'm so bummed I can get married now.
Well, or there may be people who feel like, wow, this is such a good thing.
There were some.
There are, yeah. I think it would be a big mistake to think of the gay population as one way of thinking. I mean, there are gay Republicans who might have thought it wasn't a great idea or have political reasons.
I want to interject here. We usually are very faithful about ending at 1, and I want you all not come in the future because we're not ending at 1, but we got a late start, so I've let it go a little long. Please feel free to leave if you need to, and let's just have one more question or comment.
Oh, sorry, this is a comment, is that okay?
Comment's fine.
Oh, well, I was thinking, as far as the gay island, I think that perhaps as a journalist you have to respect him and think that he can do the story, but at the same time I understand your reasoning not to hire him simply because the audience may not trust him as a source and therefore might be confused. And my second thing was that as far as objectivity goes, I think a lot of times it's your tone is dependent on the event. So for example, we had a lot of Middle Eastern series at my college, and that got a lot of controversy, not necessarily because we were biased, but because the audience itself is biased, and having to report on that, like, it got really muddy in our writing.
No, well again, with the Middle East and NPR, no matter what kind of a job they do on a story, it's clear that people read it through a particular lens, and I feel like that's something that I have to remind myself all the time, especially in, let's say, covering the presidential campaign and getting criticisms about that. And people will call up and say, you know, you are so clearly in the tank for Obama, or NPR just loves Obama. And, you know, I'd say, well, do you mind if I ask who you're supporting? And, you know, it would be McCain. And so I did actually a lot of research in terms of perceptions of bias and the way we as individuals hold on to these core beliefs. And when we see something that we really care about and it contradicts what we believe in, we tend to think it's wrong or that it's bias. And so, you know, in the Middle East coverage, it was hard to sort out as the ombudsman, you know, what was a genuine criticism and wasn't fair versus what was, well, you should have put this and this and this in the story. And I found that each person wanted this long history to be in each story about the Middle East.
Well, this has been an excellent discussion. For next week, check out paidcontent.com. Its founder, Rafat Ali, will be here. And we will have another really interesting discussion. I really am very glad you were here. And remember, I will usually get you out here by 1, so you don't become